Get on the ground now." Officer Victor Hargrove's voice cracked with authority as he yanked open the driver's door. His short-sleeved uniform already soaked with sweat under the blazing afternoon sun. Director Samuel Ortega sat perfectly still, his green polo shirt crisp despite the heat, hands visible on the steering wheel of his black sedan. "Sir, I'm going to need you to look at my identification carefully," Samuel said calmly, reaching slowly for his wallet. Hargrove's hands slammed against the doorframe. "Don't you move. Fake IDs don't work on me, and neither does that act." The officer's radio crackled with backup requests while curious shoppers gathered outside the strip mall, phones already recording. Samuel kept his voice steady, almost gentle. "Officer, I'm Director of Operations at Langley. Please examine the credentials." But Hargrove was already reaching for his taser, and none of the growing crowd knew they were about to witness a mistake that would bring down an entire precinct by dawn. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. Sitting at Riverside Shopping Center, the hot afternoon sun beat down on asphalt as shadows cast between the parked cars and storefronts. On his way home from a security briefing, Samuel Ortega saw the police cruiser light flashing in his rearview mirror. He'd stop short with a jerk, his government vehicle parked in such a way as to leave plenty of space for the officer. As he had done countless times during his 23-year federal career, everything by the book, Officer Victor Hargrove exited his patrol car, the way someone would with a badge that they think makes them more powerful. As his utility belt strap adjusted, the short sleeves of his uniform stretched over his chest while he squinted in the bright overhead sunlight. The natural lighting would prove to be quite useful, as the event would be filmed in clarity by the dozen phones that were already filming. Samuel sat unblinking in the driver's seat. His hands were positioned on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. His green polo shirt had the name of his agency embroidered on it. He didn't think the officer coming over would notice or care. For decades, he had represented the U.S. government in rooms where the appearance of competence mattered as much as actual competence. His dark slacks were pressed. As Hargrove reached the window, he heard, "Sir, I'm Director Samuel Ortega with the Central Intelligence Agency," voice calm and authoritative, like someone equipped to handle an international crisis. "I'm going to slowly reach into my jacket pocket for my credentials." Hargrove responded quickly with aggression. "Show me your hands and don't move them. I don't care what tale you're telling. Give me your license and registration now." The first bystanders had begun to gather near the entrance to the coffee shop, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. A young mother pushed her stroller closer, her phone already recording. Two teenagers paused their skateboarding to watch, instinctively sensing something was wrong. An elderly man emerged from the pharmacy, shaking his head as he observed the scene unfolding in broad daylight. Officer Samuel continued, his tone remaining professionally neutral despite the escalating situation. "I need you to understand that I'm a federal official. My credentials will verify my identity through multiple databases. Please allow me to present them properly." But Hargrove was already spiraling into the kind of aggressive posturing that had earned him 3 excessive force complaints in the past year, complaints that had been mysteriously buried by his superiors. "I said license and registration. Stop trying to confuse the situation with your fake government nonsense." The crowd stared at each other blankly. It was clear to none of the officers at that point in time that what was happening was a massive abuse of power. A delivery driver parked his van and joined the crowd while recording with his mobile phone. The sunlight falling down is perfect for seeing everything, and everything will be captured in high definition as well. Samuel took his wallet out slowly. He wanted to behave normally and not make any sudden movements. Extracted from it was a driver's license, with the addition of a federal identification card adorned with multiple security holograms, a CIA operations credential, and a top-secret clearance badge, which granted access to some of the nation's most sheltered facilities. "Officer Hargrove," Samuel said, extending the credentials through the window. "I'm Director of Operations at Langley. These documents will verify my identity through federal databases. I'm asking you to examine them carefully and contact your supervisor." Hargrove snatched the credentials, barely glancing at them before tossing them back through the window. "Nice try, but I've seen better fakes at the county fair. You think some fancy-looking cards are going to fool me?" The crowd's confusion was turning to concern. Several more phones appeared, capturing the scene from multiple angles as shoppers realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. A young professional in a business suit stepped closer, her expression troubled as she watched the officer dismiss what appeared to be legitimate federal identification without proper examination. "Sir, please." Samuel maintained his composure even as frustration began creeping into his voice. "Those credentials contain multiple security features that can be verified through federal law enforcement channels. I'm requesting that you contact your supervisor or federal liaison to confirm my identity." But Hargrove was already too deep into his power trip to back down. The presence of recording phones should have cautioned him toward professionalism, but instead seemed to fuel his aggressive display. "Get out of the car, now. You're under arrest for providing false identification to a law enforcement officer." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. This wasn't right, and everyone could sense it. The man being arrested carried himself with quiet dignity, speaking in measured tones that suggested education and authority. His clothes were expensive, his manner professional. Everything about him contradicted the officer's claims of deception. Samuel stepped out of the vehicle slowly, his hands raised to show compliance. "Officer, I'm going to comply with your instructions, but I want it on record that I've identified myself as a federal official and provided legitimate credentials that you've refused to properly examine." The afternoon sun caught the sweat beading on Hargrove's forehead as he fumbled for his handcuffs, clearly in over his head, but too proud to admit his mistake. The growing audience of witnesses watched in stunned silence as events spiraled beyond reason. Children pressed against store windows, while their parents shielded them from what was becoming an obviously unjust confrontation. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Hargrove barked, but Samuel remained facing him, keeping his hands visible. Samuel told the officer to think carefully about what he was doing, the kind of phrasing you'd try after years of hostage negotiation. "You are going to arrest a federal director because you refuse to verify legitimate credentials. Things will not end well for anyone." It was at that moment Hargrove made the call that would end his career and uncover a system of corruption right up to the top of his department. Instead of stepping back to get a supervisor, instead of taking a moment to actually assess the credentials he had dismissed, he reached for his taser. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps rippled through the gathered witnesses as they realized the situation was about to turn violent. Phones held higher, capturing every angle as a law enforcement officer prepared to use force against an unarmed man who had done nothing but present identification and request proper verification. "Stop resisting," Hargrove shouted, though Samuel hadn't moved except to keep his hands visible. "Officer, I am not resisting," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite the yellow taser now pointed at his chest. "I am a federal director requesting that you follow proper procedures. There are witnesses recording this entire interaction." But Hargrove was beyond reason now, trapped by his own escalation and too proud to admit error. The hot afternoon sun beat down on the scene as bystanders held their breath, watching a moment that would change everything for everyone involved. The taser's laser sight painted a red dot on Samuel's green polo shirt as Hargrove's finger moved toward the trigger. Around them, the ordinary afternoon shopping continued in nearby stores, oblivious to the fact that justice itself was about to be violated in broad daylight. recorded by a dozen phones, under the perfect natural lighting that would soon carry this moment to millions of viewers worldwide. While Samuel Ortega awaited the application of volts to his body, he retained his dignity by remaining calm and professional while the injustice escalated. The target puts contrast, which will soon be impossible to not see. This was not simply a bad traffic stop. This was a live system failure that happened in real time. The trigger pulled. Electricity arced through the air. And in that moment, Officer Victor Hargrove didn't just taser a federal director, he set in motion the complete destruction of a corrupt system that had operated in darkness for far too long. As Samuel Ortega collapsed to the hot asphalt, witnesses screamed in shock and horror, their phones capturing every second of an injustice so profound it would spark a reckoning that none of them could yet imagine. Electricity surges through the body of Director Samuel Ortega as he falls to the hot asphalt, leaving his green polo shirt dirt-coated and his dark slacks scraped from falling. Officer Victor Hargrove looms over the man, the taser's barbs stuck in his chest. It's a hot afternoon, and the officer's short-sleeved uniform is dark with sweat. Samuel, a federal agent, lies on the pavement, credentials scattered around beside him. Spectators gasp in horror. "Stay down!" Officer Victor Hargrove yells, still holding onto the taser. "Stop right there!" Samuel Ortega breathes slowly, fighting through the electrical aftershocks that make his muscles twitch involuntarily. Despite the pain and humiliation, his voice remains steady. "Officer, I am Director Samuel Ortega of the Central Intelligence Agency. Those are my federal credentials beside me. I need you to contact Federal Dispatch to verify my identity." "Shut up with that fake ID nonsense." Officer Victor Hargrove kicks the leather credential case further away. "You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know a fake when I see one?" A growing audience of onlookers is turning up as shoppers from the strip mall pull out their phones to film. An adolescent girl yells, "Oh my God, he just tased him for no reason." An old man shakes his head in disgust. A mother pulls her children close as they stare wide-eyed in confusion and alarm. In response, 2 police cars came screeching to the parking lot with sirens blaring. Out of the first car comes Sergeant Craig Henderson, a beefy man in middle age whose short-sleeved uniform is stretched tight across his belly. Hargrove sweeps his gaze over everything and sees the black man on the floor, the credentials scattered around, and Officer Victor Hargrove victorious with his taser. "What's the situation, Hargrove?" Sergeant Craig Henderson asks, not bothering to examine the evidence or speak to Samuel Ortega directly. "Suspect was driving erratically, then tried to pass off fake federal ID when I pulled him over." Officer Victor Hargrove lies smoothly. "Became belligerent and resistive when I questioned the authenticity. Had to deploy less lethal force to gain compliance." Samuel Ortega's jaw tightens as he hears the fabricated report, but his voice remains professional. "Sergeant Henderson, I respectfully request that you examine my federal credentials and contact CIA headquarters to verify my identity. I am Director Samuel Ortega, and this stop was conducted without probable cause." Sergeant Craig Henderson doesn't even glance at the scattered credentials. Instead, he nods approvingly at Officer Victor Hargrove. "Good work, Victor. Let's get this guy processed before he causes more trouble." The institutional betrayal cuts deeper than the taser's sting. Samuel watches as Sergeant Craig Henderson produces handcuffs, the metal gleaming under the harsh afternoon sunlight. Multiple officers now participate in what Samuel recognizes as a systematic cover-up, their actions coordinated and practiced as if they've done this many times before. "Sir, you have the right to remain silent." Sergeant Craig Henderson begins the Miranda warnings while roughly pulling Samuel's arms behind his back. The handcuffs click tight around his wrists as he continues. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "I understand my rights," Samuel responds with quiet dignity. I also understand that you are violating federal law by refusing to verify the credentials of a federal official. I am asking you one final time to contact CIA headquarters." Officer Victor Hargrove laughs harshly. "Listen to this guy, still trying to sell that story. What's next? You gonna tell us you're the president?" The crowd of witnesses grows more agitated as they watch the federal director being manhandled. A woman in a red blouse calls out, "Why won't you just check his ID? What's wrong with you people?" But the officers ignore the growing chorus of disapproval, their blue wall of silence impenetrable as they escort Samuel toward the police cruiser. His credentials remain abandoned on the asphalt. The leather case lies open, displaying his official CIA identification, federal badge, and security clearances that would immediately verify his identity to anyone willing to look. But Officer Victor Hargrove deliberately steps on the case as he passes, grinding it under his boot heel. The ride to the precinct passes in tense silence. Samuel sits in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him, watching the suburban Virginia landscape pass by through the reinforced windows. He calculates the federal violations mounting with each passing minute: false arrest, civil rights violations, assault on a federal official, conspiracy to obstruct justice. The list grows longer as the corruption reveals itself to be systematic rather than individual. At the precinct, bright fluorescent lights illuminate the booking area with harsh, institutional glare. The building's interior reflects the cold bureaucracy that enables such misconduct. Sterile white walls, worn linoleum floors, and the constant hum of official machinery processing human misery. Officer Victor Hargrove and Sergeant Craig Henderson escort Samuel through the maze of desks and filing cabinets where other officers look up with mild interest. "What'd you bag this time, Victor?" asks a detective, not bothering to hide his amusement. "Another one with delusions of grandeur," Officer Victor Hargrove replies. "Claims he's CIA. Had fake federal credentials and everything." The processing begins with methodical efficiency that reveals how routine such violations have become. Samuel's personal effects are cataloged and bagged while he repeatedly requests that someone contact federal authorities. Each request is ignored or dismissed, with increasing irritation from the officers handling his case. "Listen to me, pal," says the officer who is in charge of booking you. He is a pale man in his 30s with receding hair. "The quicker you cooperate and ditch this federal agent charade, the easier this will be for everyone. We've seen all types of fake ID you can think of," says the clerk. "I am not asking you to believe me," Samuel responds with measured patience. "I am asking you to follow proper procedure and verify credentials through official channels. That is standard protocol for any law enforcement agency." The booking officer rolls his eyes. Yeah, we'll get right on that." Name: Director Samuel Ortega, Central Intelligence Agency. Real name: Smart Guy. Samuel's composure never wavers despite the systematic humiliation. "That is my real name and position. I have served my country for over 20 years, and I deserve the basic courtesy of having my identity verified through proper channels." With Captain Diane Foster's arrival, heavy footsteps echo through the registration area. Her presence immediately draws the attention of the other officers. She is a woman in her 50s with a stern face. Dressed in uniform, she has pulled her graying hair back into a tight bun. With a cold stare, she looks at Samuel with the familiar disdain of someone who has turned prejudice into an art form. "What's the story on this one?" Captain Diane Foster asks, though her tone suggests she's already made up her mind. Sergeant Craig Henderson steps forward eagerly. "Officer Hargrove conducted a routine traffic stop on a suspicious vehicle. Driver became belligerent and tried to pass off fake federal credentials, resisted arrest, and had to be tased for officer safety." Samuel looks directly at Captain Diane Foster, recognizing that she represents his last chance for justice within the local system. "Captain, I am Director Samuel Ortega of the Central Intelligence Agency. I was subjected to an illegal traffic stop and these officers have refused to verify my federal credentials through proper channels. I request that you contact CIA headquarters immediately." Captain Diane Foster studies him for a long moment, her expression revealing nothing. Then she turns to Sergeant Craig Henderson. "Did you examine the alleged credentials?" "Yes, ma'am. Obviously fake. Poor quality printing, wrong format. We've seen better counterfeits at the local college." The lie is so blatant that Samuel actually blinks in surprise. He realizes he's witnessing not just individual corruption, but institutional rot that extends to the highest levels of the precinct. Captain Diane Foster nods approvingly at the fabricated report. "Book him on resisting arrest and providing false identification to a law enforcement officer," Captain Diane Foster orders. "Process him through the system like any other criminal." "You are making a serious mistake," Samuel says, his tone of voice that of a man who has spent decades with the feds. "I'm a federal official, and this unlawful arrest will lead to a federal investigation that will probe the operations of your department from A to Z." Captain Diane Foster's expression hardens. "Is that a threat, sir?" "It's a statement of fact. It is required by federal law to verify credentials when a person claims federal authority. Your decision not to follow a basic procedure indicates you are either incompetent or acting deliberately. Charge him with threatening a police officer while you're at it," Captain Diane Foster tells the booking officer as she spins on her heel and walks away. The holding cell is a concrete box with fluorescent lights that never dim. It is designed to break spirits and crush hope. Samuel sits on the narrow bench wearing a green polo shirt that is wrinkled and stained, and dark slacks that are torn at the knee when he fell over. Nonetheless, he sits up straight and maintains his dignity. Other prisoners eye him curiously. A young Hispanic man asks, "What they get you for, brother?" "Driving while black, apparently," Samuel replies with bitter honesty. Outside the precinct, the witnesses from the parking lot have followed the police cars. They stand on the sidewalk with their phones, sharing videos and demanding answers. The footage is already spreading beyond their personal networks as friends and family share the shocking images of an unarmed black man being tased and arrested despite presenting identification. Maria Santos, the teenager who filmed the entire encounter, uploads the video to multiple social media platforms with the caption, "Police brutality in broad daylight. They tased this man for no reason and refused to look at his ID. This is wrong. Hashtag justice now. Hashtag police brutality. Hashtag Black Lives Matter." The video starts getting views and shares in minutes. As viewers comment in shock and awe, the video is clear and will show Samuel Ortega remaining calm and professional while Officer Victor Hargrove escalates to violence without justification. In his jail cell, Samuel can hear a commotion outside. Through a tiny window, he sees the crowd of supporters expanding. Drivers halt their cars to view what's happening. Reporters get news of incident. Local news station vans start arriving on the scene. The digital wildfire begins, and Samuel Ortega's nightmare is about to become Officer Victor Hargrove's worst nightmare. The truth is being recorded in a high-quality video and shared on social networks, which will reach beyond suburban Virginia. Federal officials, civil rights leaders, and millions of everyday citizens are on the verge of exposing the routine corruption that disguises itself as law enforcement. At night, Samuel sits in his cell with dignity, knowing that justice delays but doesn't deny when the world is watching. The notification sounds began as a trickle. Marcus Thompson, a college student at Virginia Tech, had uploaded the video of Samuel Ortega's arrest to TikTok with shaking hands just 30 minutes after witnessing the incident. His caption was simple: CIA director tased by cop who wouldn't check his ID. Within the first hour, the video had 3,000 views. By hour 2, it had crossed 50,000. The algorithm had caught fire. Sarah Chen was editing her evening news segment when her producer burst through the newsroom door under the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Sarah, drop everything. We've got a federal official being brutalized by local police, and it's exploding online." She pulled up the video on her laptop, watching in horrified silence as the footage showed a distinguished black man in a green polo shirt and dark slacks being tased after calmly presenting credentials. The professionalism in Samuel Ortega's voice contrasted sharply with Officer Victor Hargrove's aggressive escalation. Sarah had covered police misconduct stories before, but this felt different. This felt seismic. Meanwhile, in a downtown Richmond apartment, community leader Cedric Monroe was fielding calls from dozens of residents who had seen the video. A tall, imposing man in his 50s, wearing an orange button-down shirt and dark jeans, Cedric had spent years documenting complaints about the precinct's treatment of minority citizens. Now, watching the video spread across Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, he felt a mixture of vindication and fury. This wasn't just another case of police misconduct. This was a CIA director being treated like a common criminal because of the color of his skin. "We march at dawn," Cedric announced to the growing crowd gathered in his community center. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated faces filled with righteous anger and determination. They can't ignore this. They can't sweep this under the rug. Not this time. Back at the precinct, the mood had shifted dramatically from the triumphant atmosphere of just hours before. Officer Victor Hargrove sat in the break room, scrolling through his phone with growing unease. The comments under the viral video were scathing. Thousands of people were demanding his badge, his arrest, his prosecution. He tried to maintain his defiant stance, but the sheer volume of outrage was overwhelming. "This is blown out of proportion," he muttered to Sergeant Craig Henderson, who stood nearby in his long-sleeved uniform, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "The guy was being suspicious. How was I supposed to know?" Sergeant Craig Henderson nodded, but his agreement felt hollow. The video clearly showed Samuel Ortega presenting credentials, speaking respectfully, and being tased without justification. Even through their lens of corruption and prejudice, the optics were devastating. Captain Diane Foster paced her office like a caged animal, her red blazer wrinkled from stress. Through her window, she could see news vans beginning to arrive in the parking lot, their satellite dishes extending toward the afternoon sky. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing. The mayor's office wanted answers. The district attorney was asking questions. Most concerning of all, she'd received 2 calls from federal agencies requesting information about the arrest of Director Samuel Ortega. "We stick to our story," she announced to the assembled officers in the briefing room. The overhead fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across their faces. Hargrove followed proper procedure. The suspect was non-compliant and presented what appeared to be fraudulent identification. "We had no choice but to subdue and arrest him." But even as she spoke, Captain Diane Foster could see doubt creeping into their expressions. The video told a different story, and they all knew it. By evening, the story had reached national television. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News all led with the footage. The anchors spoke over the now familiar scene of Samuel Ortega's calm dignity being met with Officer Victor Hargrove's unnecessary violence. Pundits debated police reform while the video played on loop, each viewing making the injustice more obvious and more damning. Samuel Ortega sat in his holding cell, maintaining the same quiet composure he'd shown during the arrest. Other inmates looked at him with a mixture of respect and disbelief. Word had spread quickly that he was a high-ranking federal official, and the circumstances of his arrest were becoming legendary within the jail. When a guard finally approached with release paperwork, Samuel stood with dignity intact. "Your attorney's here," the guard said, his tone notably more respectful than it had been hours earlier. "And sir, I want you to know, not all of us agree with what happened out there." Attorney Patrick Sullivan waited in the visitor area, a sharp-dressed man in a navy suit whose reputation for civil rights litigation preceded him. He'd driven straight from Washington, D.C. after seeing the video, recognizing immediately that this case could reshape police accountability nationwide. "Director Ortega," Patrick said, standing as Samuel entered the brightly lit room. "I'm Patrick Sullivan. I'd like to represent you in what I believe will be a landmark federal civil rights case." Samuel shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate that, Mr. Sullivan. But this isn't just about me. That precinct has been terrorizing this community for years. I want justice, not just for myself, but for every person they've brutalized who didn't have federal credentials to flash." Outside the precinct, Cedric Monroe's peaceful protest had grown from dozens to hundreds of people. They carried signs demanding accountability, their voices united in chants of "Justice for Director Ortega" and "End police corruption now." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the crowd, but their energy remained electric. Local news crews interviewed protesters, amplifying their long-ignored complaints about systematic misconduct. "We've been trying to tell people about this precinct for years," explained Maria Rodriguez, a local business owner wearing a red t-shirt and jeans. "They target our community, plant evidence, falsify reports, but nobody listened because we didn't have power. Now they messed with the wrong person." The viral nature of the video had given voice to the voiceless. Comment sections filled with similar stories from the community. People who had been afraid to speak out were now sharing their experiences, emboldened by the national attention and the undeniable evidence of misconduct. Inside the precinct, officers huddled around computers, watching their reputations crumble in real time. The video had been viewed millions of times across all platforms. Hashtags like "Justice for Ortega" and "End Police Brutality" were trending worldwide. International news outlets were picking up the story, making it a symbol of American racial injustice. Detective Nina Calloway, one of the few honest officers in the department, watched the coverage from her desk with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. She'd witnessed years of corruption and abuse, filing complaints that were buried by Captain Diane Foster's administration. Now, seeing the spotlight finally turned on their department's misconduct, she felt a spark of hope that real change might be possible. When Samuel Ortega finally emerged from the precinct building, reporters surged forward with cameras and microphones. The setting sun created perfect lighting for what would become iconic footage of dignity triumphant over injustice. Samuel stood straight, his green polo shirt somehow still neat despite his ordeal, and addressed the crowd with measured words. "I want to thank everyone who has spoken out against what happened today," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "But I also want you to know that this incident, while personally difficult, has opened my eyes to systematic problems that affect this entire community. We will not let this moment pass without demanding comprehensive accountability and reform." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Samuel wasn't finished. "I have served my country for over 2 decades, and I believe deeply in justice and the rule of law. What happened to me today happens to citizens in this community regularly. The only difference is that my federal position gave me a platform to be heard. We must use this platform to demand justice for everyone." As Samuel spoke, federal investigators in Washington, D.C. were already beginning preliminary inquiries into the precinct's practices. The viral video had created political pressure that demanded response. Phone calls were made, files were requested, and the machinery of federal oversight began to turn. Back inside the precinct, Officer Victor Hargrove watched Samuel's speech on his phone, his jaw clenched with stubborn defiance. Despite the overwhelming evidence of his misconduct, despite the millions of people calling for his prosecution, he refused to acknowledge wrongdoing. Sergeant Craig Henderson and Captain Diane Foster continued to support his version of events, doubling down on their false narrative even as it crumbled around them. But outside, justice was building momentum like a wildfire. The video had done more than document a single incident of police misconduct. It had illuminated a systematic problem and given a community the platform to demand accountability. The electric energy of social media had transformed individual outrage into collective action, and the story was far from over. As night fell over the precinct, the protesters remained, their vigil illuminated by streetlights and the glow of phone cameras still recording, still broadcasting the demand for justice. Samuel Ortega had become more than a victim. He had become a catalyst for change, and the corruption that had thrived in darkness was about to face the full scrutiny of federal investigation. The viral wildfire had been lit, and it would not be easily extinguished. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the federal building as FBI agent Jerome Washington adjusted his crisp blue suit jacket and reviewed the case files spread across his mahogany desk. His muscular frame filled the tailored suit perfectly as he studied the viral video that had ignited a firestorm across social media. The footage showed Director Samuel Ortega, dignified even as he collapsed from the taser, his green polo shirt stark against the bright pavement of that suburban Virginia strip mall. Agent Washington had spent 15 years investigating civil rights violations, but something about this case struck him as particularly egregious. A CIA director of operations, a man who had served his country with distinction for over 2 decades, brutalized by a local police officer who refused to even examine legitimate federal credentials. The blatant disrespect for federal authority suggested something deeper than individual prejudice. The soft knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. Samuel Ortega entered, wearing a navy blue jacket over khaki slacks, his bearing professional despite the ordeal he had endured. Natural light from the office windows illuminated the room as the two men shook hands. "Director Ortega, thank you for coming in," Agent Washington said, gesturing to the leather chairs arranged near the window. "I want to assure you that this investigation will be thorough and comprehensive." Samuel settled into his chair, his expression grave but determined. "Agent Washington, I need you to understand something from the outset. This isn't about personal vindication or compensation. What happened to me happens to countless others who don't have federal credentials or media attention. I want systematic change." Agent Washington leaned forward, impressed by the director's perspective. "Tell me everything that happened, starting from the moment Officer Hargrove activated his lights." For the next hour, Samuel provided meticulous testimony about his treatment. He described Officer Hargrove's immediate hostility, the refusal to examine his credentials, and the disturbing eagerness with which backup officers supported the false narrative without investigation. "What struck me most," Samuel continued, "was how rehearsed their responses seemed. Sergeant Henderson arrived and immediately backed Hargrove's story without asking questions. Captain Foster dismissed my credentials without even looking at them. This felt like a practiced routine." Agent Washington took detailed notes, recognizing the pattern Samuel described. "Did you observe anything else that suggested systematic problems?" "The booking process was telling," Samuel replied. "They processed false identification charges without any attempt to verify my identity through proper federal channels. When I requested they contact CIA verification services, they claimed the numbers were fake without calling. That level of deliberate ignorance requires institutional support." The interview revealed Samuel's sharp observational skills honed through years of intelligence work. He had noticed discrepancies in report writing, observed officers coordinating their stories, and witnessed the casual dismissal of his constitutional rights by multiple supervisors. As they concluded the initial interview, Samuel's phone buzzed with a text from his attorney. "The department called Patrick Sullivan this morning," Samuel said, reading the message. "They're offering a settlement package with an apology and policy changes." Agent Washington raised an eyebrow. "That was fast. What's your response?" "I'm declining," Samuel said without hesitation. "A settlement silences me and protects them. If there's a pattern of corruption, other victims deserve justice. I want federal charges pursued to the fullest extent." The determination in Samuel's voice reinforced Agent Washington's growing suspicions about the precinct's practices. After the director left, the agent began pulling records on similar cases from the jurisdiction. 2 hours later, another knock came at his door. A slight woman in a blue police uniform entered hesitantly, glancing over her shoulder as if checking whether she had been followed. "Agent Washington? I'm Detective Nina Calloway from the precinct where the incident occurred. I need to speak with you, but I'm risking my career by being here." Agent Washington immediately recognized the courage it took for an active officer to approach federal investigators. "Detective, please have a seat. Anything you tell me will be treated with appropriate confidentiality." Nina perched on the edge of her chair, her hands trembling slightly. What happened to Director Ortega wasn't isolated. There's been systematic misconduct in our department for years, and honest officers like me have been silenced or transferred when we try to report it. She opened a manila folder she had carried in carefully. "I've been documenting incidents for 3 years. False reports, planted evidence, excessive force cases that get buried. Captain Foster runs the department like her personal fiefdom, and officers like Hargrove know they're protected as long as they produce arrests and revenue." Agent Washington examined the documents Nina had compiled. Her meticulous records showed a disturbing pattern of civil rights violations targeting minority communities, traffic stops that escalated unnecessarily, searches without probable cause, and evidence that appeared in reports but wasn't mentioned in initial incident descriptions. "This case from last year," Agent Washington said, pointing to one file. "A young black man arrested for drug possession after a routine traffic stop. The marijuana wasn't mentioned in the initial report but appeared in the final charging documents. Sergeant Henderson planted it," Nina said quietly. "I was there. The kid was clean, but Henderson needed numbers for his monthly report. He sprinkled marijuana in the car during the search, then discovered it 15 minutes later." The revelation confirmed Agent Washington's suspicions about systematic corruption. "How extensive is this practice?" "It's standard procedure for certain officers," Nina replied. "Foster created quotas that require specific numbers of arrests and seizures. Officers who don't meet the numbers get written up or transferred to undesirable assignments. Those who exceed quotas get commendations and overtime opportunities." Nina's testimony revealed a sophisticated corruption network designed to generate revenue through targeting vulnerable populations. Asset forfeiture procedures that stripped property from citizens never convicted of crimes. Traffic enforcement concentrated in minority neighborhoods despite higher accident rates elsewhere. Court testimony that differed significantly from initial incident reports. "The Ortega case went wrong because they didn't know who they were targeting," Nina explained. "Hargrove saw a well-dressed black man in an expensive car and assumed he could apply the usual treatment without consequences. When Director Ortega presented federal credentials, Hargrove was too committed to the arrest to back down." Agent Washington spent the afternoon reviewing Nina's documentation and cross-referencing her allegations with federal databases. The patterns she described aligned with civil rights violations the FBI had been tracking across multiple jurisdictions. Later that evening, another officer contacted Agent Washington through secure channels. Officer Tamara Jenkins had been transferred to night patrol after filing excessive force complaints against colleagues. She requested an off-site meeting to provide additional testimony. They met at a coffee shop in downtown Washington. Bright fluorescent lighting overhead as evening customers filled the space. Tamara wore civilian clothes, a red sweater and dark jeans, her police radio silent in her purse. "The culture in our department is toxic," she began without preamble. "Racism isn't just tolerated, it's rewarded. Officers who show excessive aggression toward minority suspects get fast-tracked for promotions." Tamara described training sessions where supervisors taught officers to write reports that would withstand legal scrutiny while concealing constitutional violations. She witnessed evidence tampering, perjury in court proceedings, and systematic intimidation of citizens who filed complaints. Foster has connections throughout the local legal system, Tamara explained. Judges who consistently accept police testimony without question, prosecutors who decline to investigate officer misconduct, and city officials who prioritize revenue over civil rights. The scope of corruption Tamara described extended far beyond individual officer misconduct. It represented a criminal enterprise using law enforcement authority to generate profit while systematically oppressing minority communities. "Why are you coming forward now?" Agent Washington asked. "Because Director Ortega did something most victims can't do," she replied. "He survived the encounter with his dignity intact. He has resources to fight back, and his federal position demands accountability. If we can't get justice in this case, we'll never get justice for anyone." Agent Washington recognized the weight of responsibility Tamara was placing on the investigation. Samuel Ortega's case had become a symbol for countless victims of police corruption who lacked his resources and visibility. Over the following days, Agent Washington compiled testimony from additional sources. Community leader Cedric Monroe provided documentation of citizen complaints that had been ignored or buried. Attorney Patrick Sullivan shared patterns he had observed in civil litigation against the department. Local business owners described shakedown tactics disguised as regulatory enforcement. The evidence painted a picture of systematic racketeering using police powers to extract wealth from minority communities while violating fundamental constitutional rights. Financial records showed suspicious patterns in asset forfeiture proceeds and overtime payments to officers who generated the most revenue through arrests and seizures. Agent Washington presented his preliminary findings to federal prosecutors, who authorized expanded investigation authority. The case against Officer Hargrove for assaulting Director Ortega was just the beginning of a comprehensive examination of institutional corruption. As the investigation expanded, Agent Washington maintained regular contact with Samuel Ortega, who continued providing insights from his intelligence background. The director's analytical skills proved invaluable in identifying patterns and connections that might have been overlooked. "This reminds me of counterintelligence work," Samuel observed during one of their meetings. "They created parallel systems to hide their activities from oversight. Official reports that document legal activities while the real business happens off the books." The investigation reached a critical threshold when Agent Washington obtained sufficient evidence to support federal warrants. Years of civil rights violations, financial crimes, and conspiracy charges against multiple defendants including Captain Foster, Officer Hargrove, and Sergeant Henderson. Samuel Ortega reviewed the warrant applications, his expression satisfied but somber. "This represents justice for more than just me," he said. "Every person who suffered under this corrupt system deserves to see accountability." Agent Washington sealed the warrant packages and prepared for the next phase of the investigation. Dawn raids would simultaneously target the homes and offices of the conspiracy's key figures, designed to prevent evidence destruction and demonstrate federal authority. The courage shown by Detective Calloway and Officer Jenkins in risking their careers to expose corruption had made comprehensive justice possible. Samuel Ortega's determination to seek systematic change rather than personal compensation had created the opportunity to dismantle an entire criminal network operating under law enforcement cover. As Agent Washington prepared the final operational plans, he reflected on the transformation from a simple excessive force case to a comprehensive racketeering investigation. Samuel Ortega's dignity under pressure had not only preserved his own integrity, but created the foundation for justice that would protect countless future victims from the same systematic oppression. The federal machinery of justice was now fully mobilized, ready to demonstrate that no one, regardless of their authority, could violate constitutional rights with impunity. The digital clock on FBI agent Jerome Washington's dashboard glowed 5:15 a.m. as he adjusted his tactical vest and spoke into his radio headset. The muscular federal investigator sat in the lead vehicle of a convoy, positioned 3 blocks from the precinct, portable floodlights already being set up by his team to supplement the weak early dawn light. His blue tactical jacket bore the bold yellow FBI letters across the back, and his expression carried the weight of weeks of meticulous preparation. All units, this is Washington. We have green light for Operation Clean Sweep. Teams Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie confirm positions. Static crackled through his earpiece as confirmations came in from the 3 simultaneous raid locations. Agent Washington had spent countless hours coordinating this moment, ensuring that Captain Diane Foster, Officer Victor Hargrove, and Sergeant Craig Henderson would all be taken into custody at precisely the same time to prevent any destruction of evidence or communication between the conspirators. Alpha team in position at Foster residence. Came the first response. Bravo team ready at Hargrove location. Followed immediately. Charlie team locked and loaded at Henderson house. Completed the trio of confirmations. Agent Washington checked his watch one final time. In exactly 15 minutes, the systematic corruption that had plagued this community for years would begin its final unraveling. Director Samuel Ortega's case had provided the key that would unlock justice for countless victims who had suffered under this network of racist officers and their enablers. Execute, execute, execute. Agent Washington commanded into his radio. At the Foster residence, a sprawling colonial home in an upscale neighborhood, Agent Martinez led 8 muscular federal agents in tactical gear up the manicured walkway. The portable floodlights they had positioned cast harsh white light across the front lawn, turning the early morning darkness into a stage for justice. Agent Martinez's green tactical shirt was clearly visible beneath his protective vest as he approached the front door. The thunderous knock that followed was designed to announce federal authority. FBI, search warrant, open the door immediately. Inside the house, Captain Diane Foster jolted awake in her king-sized bed. The corrupt precinct commander, wearing a red nightgown as she scrambled to consciousness, immediately understood the gravity of her situation. Years of covering up civil rights violations and orchestrating systematic corruption had finally caught up with her. Foster stumbled toward her home office, her red nightgown flowing behind her as she desperately tried to reach her computer. She needed to delete files, destroy evidence, eliminate any digital trail that could connect her to the network of corruption she had built and protected. Her fingers trembled as she powered on the machine, knowing that federal agents were probably already breaking down her front door. Federal agents, we're coming in. Agent Martinez's voice boomed through the house as the tactical team breached the entrance. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the Foster home as agents flooded through the doorway. Their tactical boots thundered across hardwood floors while Foster frantically clicked through files on her computer screen. Financial records showing kickbacks from private prison companies filled her monitor, evidence of the profit motive behind targeting minority communities for arrest and asset forfeiture. Agent Martinez reached Foster's office just as she was attempting to initiate a system-wide deletion of her hard drive. "Step away from the computer, Captain Foster. Place your hands where we can see them." Foster's face contorted with rage and desperation as she realized her destruction of evidence had been interrupted. The red nightgown she wore seemed to mirror the anger in her eyes as she slowly raised her hands, knowing that years of corruption were about to be exposed in excruciating detail. Simultaneously, at Officer Victor Hargrove's modest suburban home, Agent Rodriguez was leading his own team of muscular federal agents through a similar breach. The portable floodlights positioned around Hargrove's property illuminated curious neighbors who had emerged from their houses to witness the dramatic federal raid unfolding in their quiet residential area. Hargrove, startled from sleep by the thunderous announcement of federal agents, stumbled through his hallway wearing boxer shorts and a wrinkled t-shirt. Unlike Foster, he made no attempt to destroy evidence. His arrogance ran so deep that he still believed his actions against Director Samuel Ortega had been justified, that somehow his racist assumptions and systematic targeting of minority citizens would be defended by his corrupt superiors. Victor Hargrove, you are under arrest for civil rights violations, assault, and conspiracy, Agent Rodriguez announced as tactical agents secured the house. The neighbors watched in shock as the officer they had known for years was led outside in handcuffs. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman in a blue jacket who had lived next door to Hargrove for over a decade, stood on her front porch with her hand covering her mouth in disbelief. She had always thought of Hargrove as a dedicated public servant, never imagining the systematic racism and corruption that defined his actual police work. At the third location, Sergeant Craig Henderson's apartment complex was surrounded by Agent Thompson's tactical team. Henderson, the corrupt officer who had participated in evidence planting and report falsification for years, lived in a rundown complex that reflected his paranoid and isolated lifestyle. The portable floodlights set up by federal agents cast stark shadows across the parking lot as residents peered through windows to witness the federal operation. Henderson had heard the simultaneous raids on his police radio and was attempting to flee through his apartment's back window when federal agents apprehended him. His green t-shirt was torn in the struggle, and his face showed the panic of someone who knew exactly why federal agents had come for him. "Going somewhere, Sergeant?" Agent Thompson asked as Henderson was secured and read his rights. Back at the precinct building, Agent Jerome Washington personally led the most crucial phase of Operation Clean Sweep. The main police station had been cordoned off with federal vehicles, and portable floodlights bathed the entire building in harsh white light that supplemented the weak early morning dawn. Dozens of muscular federal agents in tactical gear moved with precision through every department, seizing computers, files, and evidence that would document years of systematic corruption. The scene was methodical and overwhelming. Agent Washington watched as his teams cataloged box after box of falsified police reports, evidence bags that had been tampered with, and financial records that revealed the profit motive behind targeting minority communities. The corruption network was more sophisticated and extensive than even he had initially imagined. Agent Washington called Agent Stevens from the records room. "You need to see this." Washington walked through the precinct hallways, noting how different the building felt under federal occupation. The fluorescent lights overhead illuminated corners and crevices where corruption had festered for years, hidden from public oversight and accountability. Now every file cabinet, every computer terminal, every piece of evidence was being systematically examined and cataloged. Agent Stevens, a muscular investigator wearing a blue tactical shirt, held up a thick folder filled with complaint forms. "These are citizen complaints against Hargrove, Henderson, and other officers going back 5 years. Every single one was marked unfounded, without investigation. But look at this." He handed Washington a separate folder containing the original complaint narratives before they were officially processed. The pattern was unmistakable. Minority citizens reporting excessive force, illegal searches, planted evidence, and racial profiling. Every complaint had been systematically buried by Captain Foster and her network of corrupt supervisors. "This is exactly what Director Ortega described," Washington observed. "Systematic suppression of civil rights complaints to protect officers engaged in racial targeting." In Foster's office, agents discovered the financial records that revealed the true scope of the corruption network. Asset forfeiture had generated millions of dollars in revenue for the department, with bonuses paid to officers who seized the most property from minority citizens. Private prison companies had provided kickbacks for maintaining high arrest rates in Black and Hispanic communities. Local judges and prosecutors had been complicit in the scheme, rubber stamping false charges and accepting planted evidence without question. Agent Martinez approached Washington with a laptop computer seized from Foster's home. "The encryption on this was amateur level. We've already accessed her email communications with Henderson and Hargrove. They were coordinating their stories about the Ortega arrest, planning to claim he was combative and threatening. Washington shook his head in disgust. The audacity of these corrupt officers in attempting to falsely characterize a respected CIA director as a criminal demonstrated just how embedded their racist assumptions had become. They had operated with such impunity for so long that they believed they could get away with brutalizing a federal official in broad daylight. "What about the financial connections?" Washington asked. "Even better," Martinez replied. Foster kept detailed records of payments received from the private prison company. Every arrested citizen meant revenue for the department and personal bonuses for participating officers. They had quotas for minority arrests to maximize their profit margins. The corruption was breathtakingly systematic. Washington realized that Samuel Ortega's traffic stop was not an isolated incident of racial profiling, but rather the routine operation of a department that had monetized the oppression of minority communities. The profit motive had driven officers to actively seek out Black and Hispanic citizens, to arrest on false charges, plant evidence when necessary, and suppress any complaints about their conduct. At 7:30 a.m., as the sun finally rose high enough to provide natural lighting that supplemented the portable floodlights, Director Samuel Ortega arrived at the precinct. Washington had called him the night before, wanting the respected CIA official to witness justice being served against the officers who had brutalized him. Samuel walked through the cordon of federal vehicles, wearing a crisp blue suit and dark slacks, his bearing dignified and professional despite everything he had endured. Community members had gathered behind the police barriers, many holding signs demanding accountability and justice. Community leader Cedric Monroe stood among them, having organized the early morning gathering to witness this historic moment. Director Ortega, Agent Washington greeted him formally. "I wanted you to see this. Your courage in pursuing federal charges instead of accepting a quick settlement has made all of this possible." Samuel observed the methodical federal operation with quiet satisfaction. Boxes of evidence were being loaded into federal vehicles, while corrupt officers were being perp-walked in handcuffs past the same cameras that had recorded his own illegal arrest weeks earlier. The contrast was profound. Federal agents conducting a professional constitutional operation versus the racist brutality he had experienced from local officers. "How extensive is the corruption?" Samuel asked. "Worse than we initially thought," Washington replied. "This wasn't just a few bad officers. This was systematic targeting of minority communities for financial profit, enabled by corrupt supervisors and complicit judges. Your case opened the door to documenting years of civil rights violations that were covered up and ignored." Detective Nina Calloway, the honest officer who had served as a whistleblower, stood near the federal command post, watching her corrupt colleagues being arrested. Her cooperation had been crucial in understanding the internal dynamics of the department and identifying which officers were honest versus complicit in the corruption network. "Detective Calloway," Samuel approached her. "Agent Washington tells me your testimony was crucial in exposing this corruption." Nina, wearing her standard police uniform, but clearly allied with the federal operation, nodded solemnly. "Director Ortega, I've watched this department destroy lives for years. Minority citizens would come to me with legitimate complaints about planted evidence and excessive force, but Captain Foster would bury every report. Your case finally gave us the federal oversight we needed to expose the truth." Officer Tamara Jenkins, another honest officer who had provided testimony about the toxic culture of racism within the department, joined their conversation. "The honest officers always knew this was going on, but we were threatened with retaliation if we spoke up. Foster made it clear that whistleblowers would be fired or worse." Samuel listened to their accounts with growing understanding of how systematic the corruption had become. It wasn't simply individual racist officers acting independently, but rather an entire institutional structure designed to protect and profit from the oppression of minority citizens. Agent Washington approached the group with a thick folder of evidence. "Director Ortega, I wanted you to see this before we transport it to federal court." He opened the folder to reveal hundreds of falsified police reports targeting Black and Hispanic citizens. Every one of these represents a family destroyed by false charges, planted evidence, or excessive force. Your courage in fighting back has given all these victims a voice. The scope of victimization was staggering. Samuel realized that his own traffic stop, traumatic as it had been, represented just one instance in a pattern of systematic oppression that had damaged countless lives. The federal investigation had revealed the true cost of allowing corruption to flourish without oversight or accountability. As the morning progressed and all evidence was cataloged and removed, the precinct building stood empty and powerless. The corrupt network that had operated with impunity for years had been dismantled in a single coordinated operation. Federal authority had asserted itself definitively, sending a clear message that civil rights violations would face serious consequences regardless of the perpetrator's position or connections. Community members pressed against the barriers, many wiping away tears as they witnessed justice finally being served. For years, their complaints had been ignored, their suffering dismissed, their voices silenced by a corrupt system that profited from their oppression. Now, federal agents were treating their victimization as serious crimes worthy of comprehensive investigation and prosecution. Samuel stood among them, no longer just a victim of police brutality, but a symbol of resistance and accountability. His decision to pursue federal charges rather than accept a quiet settlement had opened the floodgates for systematic reform and justice. The Dawn Raid represented not just the arrest of corrupt officers, but the beginning of a new era of constitutional policing and community trust. The portable floodlights were being packed away as natural sunlight now fully illuminated the scene. Justice had been served in broad daylight, with transparency and federal oversight replacing the darkness of corruption that had plagued the community for far too long. The bright fluorescent lights of the federal courthouse cast harsh shadows across the conference room, where FBI agent Jerome Washington spread dozens of evidence folders across a mahogany table. His muscular frame, clad in a crisp blue suit and white dress shirt, moved with purpose as he organized years of corruption into a damning narrative. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the documents that would destroy careers and expose decades of systematic oppression. What we've uncovered goes far beyond a single traffic stop, Agent Washington announced to the assembled federal prosecutors. Director Samuel Ortega's arrest was merely the catalyst that exposed a criminal enterprise operating under the guise of law enforcement. The lead prosecutor, a stern woman in professional attire, leaned forward as Agent Washington opened the first folder. Inside were financial records seized from Captain Diane Foster's home, revealing a web of corruption that stretched back 15 years. Bank statements showed regular deposits from private prison companies, payments that coincided perfectly with spikes in arrests targeting minority communities. Captain Foster received monthly payments of $5,000 from Sunshine Corrections Corporation, Agent Washington explained, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. These payments increased whenever her precinct delivered higher arrest numbers from specific zip codes, predominantly Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. The evidence was staggering. Foster's personal accounts showed over $400,000 in suspicious deposits, carefully structured to avoid federal reporting requirements. Asset forfeiture records revealed systematic seizures of vehicles, cash, and property from minority citizens, with proceeds flowing directly into department coffers and private accounts. Agent Washington moved to the next folder, this one containing Officer Victor Hargrove's personnel file and the complaints that had been systematically buried. Hargrove has 17 excessive force complaints spanning 8 years, all involving minority victims. Every single complaint was dismissed without proper investigation. The pattern was unmistakable. Young black men stopped for minor traffic violations and subjected to violent arrests. Hispanic business owners harassed with repeated inspections and citations until they relocated or closed. Families terrorized during late-night raids based on falsified warrants and planted evidence. This report from 2019 details Hargrove tasing a 17-year-old honors student during a routine traffic stop. Agent Washington continued, his jaw tightening with controlled anger. The boy was reaching for his registration when Hargrove deployed his weapon. The incident was classified as justified use of force. Across town, in another federal building, bathed in natural skylight, Director Samuel Ortega sat before a grand jury, his green polo shirt and dark slacks, a stark contrast to the formal legal proceedings surrounding him. His testimony carried the full weight of his federal credentials and unimpeachable reputation. What I experienced was not an isolated incident of poor judgment, Samuel testified, his voice steady and authoritative. It was part of a systematic campaign of terror against citizens whose only crime was the color of their skin. The grand jurors listened in horrified silence as Samuel detailed his treatment, but more importantly, his observations during the arrest and processing. He described seeing falsified reports being prepared in real time, watched officers coordinate their stories, witnessed evidence being manufactured to support false charges. I observed Sergeant Henderson instructing officers on how to phrase their reports to justify excessive force, Samuel continued. He specifically mentioned targeting what he called problem communities for aggressive enforcement. Back at the federal building, Agent Washington presented Detective Nina Calloway's whistleblower testimony. The honest officer had documented years of corruption, secretly recording conversations and photographing evidence before it could be destroyed or altered. Her courage in coming forward provided the insider perspective that transformed speculation into prosecutable crimes. Detective Calloway's evidence shows systematic evidence planting, Agent Washington announced, opening another folder filled with photographs and audio recordings. Officers regularly carried throwaway weapons, drugs, and contraband to plant during arrests when their initial searches came up empty. The recordings were damning. Captain Foster's voice clearly instructing officers to find something on suspects who couldn't be charged with their initial offenses. Sergeant Henderson explaining how to properly plant evidence to avoid legal challenges. Officer Hargrove bragging about his arrest numbers and the bonuses they generated. One particularly chilling recording captured Foster explaining the department's strategy. We focus on neighborhoods where complaints don't get traction. Poor families, immigrants, people without political connections. They can scream all they want, but nobody listens. The financial corruption extended beyond private prison kickbacks. Asset forfeiture had become a profit center, with officers specifically targeting minority-owned businesses and residents they suspected of carrying cash. Seizure records showed millions of dollars confiscated over 5 years, with less than 10% ever returned to rightful owners. Agent Washington displayed spreadsheets showing the correlation between seizures and officer bonuses. The more they stole, the more they earned. It created a direct financial incentive for constitutional violations. The investigation had uncovered connections to local political corruption that reached the mayor's office. Lorraine Castillo, the city's chief executive, had received detailed reports about police misconduct complaints, but had systematically ignored them in exchange for campaign contributions from police unions and private corrections companies. Mayor Castillo's office received over 200 formal complaints about police misconduct in the past 3 years, Agent Washington revealed. Not a single complaint was forwarded to appropriate oversight agencies. Instead, they were filed away and forgotten. Email evidence showed Castillo's staff actively suppressing media coverage of police incidents, pressuring local news outlets to downplay stories of police misconduct, and coordinating with police leadership to discredit complaint filers. The systematic targeting of minority communities had devastated entire neighborhoods. Business districts that had once thrived were now struggling, their owners driven away by constant harassment and impossible regulatory requirements selectively enforced against non-white businesses. Community leader Cedric Monroe had organized support groups for victims who were finally coming forward after years of silence. The federal investigation had created a safe space for people to share their experiences without fear of retaliation. Families were terrorized in their own homes. Monroe testified before investigators. Children learned to fear police officers instead of trusting them for protection. Entire communities lived under occupation by officers who saw them as enemies rather than citizens to serve. The evidence revealed a sophisticated system of oppression disguised as law enforcement. Traffic stops were used as pretexts for searches and seizures. Minor violations became major arrests through evidence planting and charge stacking. Community complaints were ignored, discouraged, or actively suppressed. Agent Washington presented timeline evidence showing how the corruption had evolved and expanded over 15 years. What began as individual officers cutting corners had grown into an organized criminal enterprise with its own protocols, training, and profit-sharing arrangements. This wasn't a few bad apples, Agent Washington explained to prosecutors. This was an entire orchard that had been systematically poisoned from the roots up. Samuel's federal testimony provided crucial credibility to victims who had been dismissed and ignored for years. His position and reputation gave voice to the voiceless, transforming their individual complaints into a federal civil rights case that demanded justice. Every citizen who was victimized by this criminal conspiracy deserves vindication, Samuel testified. My arrest brought national attention to practices that had been destroying lives and communities for over a decade. The grand jury proceedings revealed the full scope of constitutional violations. Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure had been systematically ignored. 14th Amendment equal protection guarantees had been deliberately violated through racially targeted enforcement. Due process rights had been trampled through falsified reports and manufactured evidence. Detective Nina Calloway's testimony provided the most damaging insider perspective. She described a culture where constitutional violations were not only tolerated but encouraged and rewarded. Officers who questioned aggressive tactics were marginalized and transferred. Those who participated enthusiastically received promotions and bonuses. Speaking up meant career suicide, she testified. The corruption was so deep that honest officers had no safe way to report misconduct without destroying their own livelihoods. Officer Tamara Jenkins, another honest cop who had documented the toxic culture, testified about systematic intimidation of officers who showed any sympathy for minority communities. The corruption had created a police state within the police force itself. As evidence mounted throughout the day, the federal prosecutors began crafting indictments that would span racketeering, civil rights violations, conspiracy, and financial crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony credible, and the pattern of behavior undeniable. The investigation had revealed that Samuel Ortega's traffic stop was not an anomaly but rather business as usual for a corrupt department that had operated with impunity for years. His arrest had simply been recorded and broadcast, forcing accountability that had been systematically avoided for over a decade. Agent Washington closed his presentation with a simple but powerful statement. Director Samuel Ortega's dignified response to illegal treatment has exposed a criminal conspiracy that violated the constitutional rights of thousands of citizens. Justice demands that every participant in this conspiracy face federal prosecution. The bright afternoon sunlight streaming through courthouse windows illuminated stacks of evidence that would forever change a community's relationship with law enforcement. Truth had finally emerged from decades of darkness, and federal justice was prepared to respond with overwhelming force. The morning sun streamed through the towering windows of the federal courthouse, casting brilliant beams of light across the marble floors where hundreds of people had gathered. Director Samuel Ortega adjusted his crisp blue jacket as he walked through the crowd, his measured steps echoing in the grand hallway. The weight of this moment settled around him like a mantle of responsibility, knowing that today would bring accountability for the systematic corruption that had nearly destroyed his faith in justice. Inside courtroom 4A, natural daylight illuminated every corner as federal prosecutor Amanda Richardson stood before a packed gallery. Her red blouse caught the morning light as she addressed the assembled media, community leaders, and victims who had waited years for this moment. The fluorescent lights overhead combined with the streaming sunlight to create an atmosphere of transparency that had been absent from the local precinct for far too long. Today, the United States Department of Justice announces comprehensive federal indictments against 12 individuals involved in a systematic conspiracy to violate the civil rights of citizens while operating under color of law, Prosecutor Richardson declared, her voice carrying the full weight of federal authority. The courtroom fell silent, except for the soft clicking of camera shutters and the scratching of pens on notepads. Samuel Ortega sat in the front row, his presence serving as a powerful reminder of how this investigation had begun with a single traffic stop that exposed decades of corruption. His dark slacks were pressed to perfection, and despite everything he had endured, his posture remained dignified and strong. Around him sat other victims who had finally found the courage to come forward, their faces reflecting a mixture of vindication and sobering recognition of the systematic oppression they had endured. Captain Diane Foster faces 18 federal charges, including conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, racketeering, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. The prosecutor continued, the evidence shows that Captain Foster operated a criminal enterprise within the police department, systematically targeting minority communities for harassment, false arrests, and asset forfeiture schemes that generated illegal revenue for the department and personal enrichment for the conspirators. In the gallery, community leader Cedric Monroe gripped the wooden bench, his knuckles showing the tension of years of fighting against this very corruption. He wore a green button-down shirt and dark pants, his usual protest attire replaced by the formal clothing befitting this historic moment. Beside him, dozens of community members who had been victimized by the corrupt system watched as their long-standing complaints were finally validated by the highest levels of law enforcement. Officer Victor Hargrove faces 14 federal charges including assault under color of law, false imprisonment, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and systematic deprivation of constitutional rights, Prosecutor Richardson announced. The name sent a ripple through the courtroom as people remembered the viral video that had started this avalanche of justice. The investigation reveals that Officer Hargrove engaged in a pattern of excessive force targeting African American and Hispanic citizens, with his supervisors actively covering up complaints and falsifying incident reports. Samuel Ortega closed his eyes briefly, remembering the moment when Victor Hargrove had tased him on that bright afternoon outside the strip mall. The memory still stung, but now it carried the weight of vindication rather than humiliation. He had endured that violation not just for himself, but for every person who had suffered similar treatment without the credentials or platform to demand accountability. Sergeant Craig Henderson faces 12 federal charges including evidence tampering, conspiracy, perjury, and civil rights violations. The prosecutor continued, Henderson was instrumental in the systematic planting of evidence, falsification of police reports, and intimidation of witnesses who attempted to report misconduct. Attorney Patrick Sullivan, representing Samuel Ortega and dozens of other victims, sat at the counsel table in his navy blue suit, reviewing the extensive civil rights lawsuits he had prepared. The federal indictments would strengthen their case for monetary damages, but more importantly, they represented a fundamental shift in how the justice system approached police accountability. His briefcase contained settlements that would help rebuild lives destroyed by years of systematic oppression. The indictments extend beyond the police department to include Judge Patricia Whitman and Prosecutor Marcus Webb, both of whom accepted bribes to dismiss cases against officers involved in misconduct and to expedite prosecutions of fabricated charges against minority defendants. Prosecutor Richardson revealed. The courtroom gasped at this revelation of how deeply the corruption had penetrated the local justice system. FBI agent Jerome Washington stood against the back wall, his muscular frame filling out his dark suit as he surveyed the proceedings he had helped orchestrate. The Dawn raid 6 weeks ago had been just the beginning of unraveling a conspiracy that reached into every level of local law enforcement and government. His investigation had revealed financial records showing hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal revenue generated through systematic targeting of minority communities. Mayor Lorraine Castillo was notably absent from the proceedings, facing her own political reckoning as recall petitions circulated throughout the city. The investigation had revealed her knowledge of complaints against the department and her active role in suppressing federal oversight. Her red campaign posters, once symbols of progressive leadership, now served as reminders of how corruption could hide behind any political facade. Detective Nina Calloway and Officer Tamara Jenkins, who courageously came forward as whistleblowers despite facing retaliation and intimidation, will be recognized by the Department of Justice for their service to constitutional law enforcement, the prosecutor announced. Both women sat in the witness section, Calloway in a professional orange blouse and dark skirt, Jenkins in her dress uniform, representing the honest officers who had risked everything to expose the truth. The detective had provided crucial insider testimony about the culture of corruption that pervaded the department, while Officer Jenkins had documented specific incidents of misconduct and cover-ups. Their courage had been instrumental in building the comprehensive case that now promised to dismantle the entire corrupt network. Samuel Ortega stood as Prosecutor Richardson addressed him directly. Director Ortega, your decision to pursue federal charges rather than accept a quick settlement has made justice possible for hundreds of victims who lacked the platform to demand accountability. Your case became the catalyst that exposed systematic civil rights violations spanning more than a decade. The applause that followed was not celebratory but respectful, acknowledging the price that Samuel Ortega had paid to ensure that his experience led to meaningful change. He nodded graciously, understanding that his federal position had given him opportunities for justice that too many others had been denied. The financial investigation reveals that the conspiracy generated over $2 million in illegal revenue through falsified arrests, evidence planting, and asset forfeiture schemes targeting minority business owners. The prosecutor continued, these funds were distributed among conspirators and used to purchase equipment and vehicles that facilitated further civil rights violations. Community leader Cedric Monroe thought of the small business owners in his neighborhood who had been systematically harassed, their success viewed as justification for increased police attention rather than community pride. The federal indictments validated years of community organizing and peaceful protest that had been dismissed by local officials as unfounded complaints from unreliable sources. The sentences being sought by federal prosecutors range from 15 to 25 years in federal prison, reflecting the serious nature of these crimes and the systematic betrayal of public trust, Prosecutor Richardson announced. The courtroom remained silent as the gravity of these potential sentences sank in. This was not a slap on the wrist or administrative punishment, but serious federal prison time that reflected the magnitude of the constitutional violations. Samuel Ortega prepared to leave the courthouse as the formal proceedings concluded, but Prosecutor Richardson had one final announcement. Director Ortega has agreed to make a public statement regarding the resolution of this case and his vision for moving forward. The media crowded around as Samuel Ortega stepped to the microphone that had been set up on the courthouse steps. The natural daylight illuminated his face as he looked out over the gathered crowd, seeing community members, honest police officers, federal agents, and journalists, all waiting for his words. The moment carried the weight of history, representing a turning point in the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served. 6 months ago, I was subjected to a traffic stop that violated every principle of constitutional law enforcement. Samuel Ortega began, his voice carrying the measured authority that had served him throughout his federal career. What happened to me was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic pattern of civil rights violations that targeted entire communities based on race and ethnicity. The crowd listened intently as he continued. These federal indictments represent more than accountability for individual officers. They demonstrate that no one, regardless of rank or position, is above the law when they violate the constitutional rights of American citizens. Samuel Ortega paused, looking out over faces that reflected hope mixed with the sobering recognition of how much work remained to rebuild trust between law enforcement and communities. But indictments alone cannot heal the damage caused by years of systematic oppression. Real change requires honest acknowledgement of past wrongs, comprehensive reform of police practices, and ongoing commitment to constitutional law enforcement. Community leader Cedric Monroe led the applause that followed, understanding that Samuel Ortega was calling for healing rather than revenge, reform rather than retaliation. The director's response embodied the kind of leadership that could bridge divides and create lasting change rather than simply punishing misconduct after the fact. I call upon federal oversight agencies, local leaders, and community members to work together in rebuilding a law enforcement system that serves and protects all citizens equally. Samuel Ortega concluded. The courage shown by Detective Calloway, Officer Jenkins, and the community members who came forward despite intimidation proves that change is possible when people of conscience stand up for constitutional principles. As the crowd began to disperse, Samuel Ortega remained on the courthouse steps, shaking hands with community members and speaking individually with victims who had found their voice through his case. The natural sunlight streaming down seemed to symbolize the transparency and accountability that had finally penetrated a system that had operated in shadows for too long. The federal indictments represented more than legal accountability. They validated the experiences of countless victims, vindicated years of community organizing, and demonstrated that the constitutional principles of equal justice under law could still triumph over systematic corruption and racial bias. FBI agent Jerome Washington approached Samuel Ortega as the crowd thinned, extending his hand in mutual respect between federal law enforcement officers who had served the Constitution properly. Their partnership had demonstrated how the system could work when honest investigators had the courage to pursue truth regardless of political pressure or institutional resistance. Attorney Patrick Sullivan organized his files, knowing that the civil rights lawsuits would now proceed with the full weight of federal criminal convictions behind them. The monetary settlements would provide compensation for years of illegal treatment, but more importantly, they would fund community programs and police reform initiatives that could prevent future violations. As Samuel Ortega finally left the courthouse, walking through the dispersing crowd in his perfectly pressed blue jacket and dark slacks, he carried with him the satisfaction of knowing that his experience had led to systematic change. The viral video that had once represented his humiliation now stood as evidence of accountability achieved and justice served. The federal indictments marked not an ending, but a beginning of the long process of rebuilding trust, implementing reforms, and ensuring that constitutional law enforcement served all communities equally. Samuel Ortega's case had become the catalyst for transformation that extended far beyond individual punishment to systematic change that could protect future generations from the corruption that had nearly destroyed his faith in American justice. 6 months had passed since that fateful afternoon when Director Samuel Ortega was brutalized during what should have been a routine traffic stop. Now standing in the brilliant morning sunlight streaming through the windows of the renovated community center, Samuel surveyed a scene that would have been impossible to imagine during those dark hours in the holding cell. The transformation was nothing short of remarkable. Where once stood a community fractured by fear and mistrust, now gathered citizens and law enforcement officers working side by side, their faces illuminated by hope and determination. Samuel adjusted his crisp blue suit jacket and navy slacks, preparing to address the crowd that had assembled for the dedication of the new Community Oversight Board. 6 months ago, Samuel began, his voice carrying clearly across the packed room. I experienced firsthand what too many in this community have endured for years. But today, we stand not in the shadow of that injustice, but in the light of what we've built together. The crowd erupted in applause. In the front row sat Detective Nina Calloway, now Captain Calloway, resplendent in her new uniform, with long sleeves bearing the insignia of her hard-earned rank. Beside her, Officer Tamara Jenkins wore her short-sleeved uniform with pride, a folder of new training materials in her lap. These were the officers who had risked their careers to stand for truth, and now they led a department reborn. The gathered audience included faces that told the story of this transformation. Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman in a blue jacket, had been one of the first victims to come forward after Samuel's arrest went viral. Her small grocery store had been repeatedly targeted by Officer Victor Hargrove's crew, subjected to unnecessary inspections and harassment that nearly drove her out of business. Now she served on the Community Oversight Board, her voice finally heard and respected. Young Marcus Thompson, wearing a bright orange polo shirt and dark jeans, represented the next generation of community leaders. At 19, he had witnessed his father's wrongful arrest 3 years prior, an incident that had been covered up until the federal investigation brought it to light. The settlement his family received had allowed Marcus to attend college, where he studied criminal justice with dreams of reforming the system from within. Community leader Cedric Monroe stepped to the podium next, his green polo shirt and dark slacks, a stark contrast to the protest signs he had once carried. We demanded accountability, he declared, and we got transformation. We demanded justice, and we got renewal. But most importantly, we demanded to be heard. And now, we have a permanent voice in how our community is policed. The Community Oversight Board represented something unprecedented in the county's history. Comprised of residents, business owners, clergy, and civil rights advocates, it held real power to investigate complaints, review policies, and ensure that the corruption that had festered under Captain Diane Foster's leadership could never take root again. FBI agent Jerome Washington, his muscular frame filling out a sharp blue suit and matching tie, observed from the back of the room. His investigation had uncovered corruption so deep and systematic that federal oversight would continue for years to come. But today's ceremony represented hope that such oversight might one day no longer be necessary. The sentences handed down by the federal court had sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the state. Captain Diane Foster received 15 years in federal prison for racketeering, civil rights violations, and conspiracy. Her red prison uniform was a far cry from the authority she had once wielded so corruptly. Officer Victor Hargrove, the man whose racism and brutality had started it all, was sentenced to 12 years for assault under color of law, false imprisonment, and systematic civil rights violations. Sergeant Craig Henderson received 8 years for evidence tampering and conspiracy. But Samuel knew that true justice wasn't measured only in prison sentences. It was measured in the young faces now looking up at him as he visited Jefferson Elementary School later that afternoon. The bright fluorescent lights and natural skylight illuminated a classroom full of children whose futures looked brighter because of the changes their community had fought for and won. What does it mean to do the right thing when it's hard? Samuel asked the 5th grade class. A young girl in the front row raised her hand eagerly. It means standing up even when you're scared? Exactly, Samuel smiled. Sometimes doing the right thing costs us something, but doing the wrong thing costs everyone. He noticed how the children's eyes followed his every word, their young minds absorbing lessons about courage and integrity that would shape their futures. These were the children who would grow up in a world where police officers were held accountable, where federal oversight meant protection rather than intrusion, where speaking truth to power was not only possible but celebrated. This was the scholarship program Samuel had established, not just providing money for college, but mentoring young people who wanted to pursue careers in public service, law enforcement, and justice. The Samuel Ortega Civic Leadership Scholarship had already awarded its first grants to high school students committed to serving their communities with integrity. Attorney Patrick Sullivan had worked tirelessly to secure settlements for the dozens of victims whose cases had been uncovered during the investigation. Families who had been wrongfully arrested, businesses that had been targeted for harassment, citizens whose civil rights had been systematically violated, all found their voices validated and their suffering acknowledged. The financial settlements totaled millions, but more importantly, they represented a formal recognition that their pain had been real and unacceptable. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Samuel walked through downtown, an area that had been transformed by the removal of the corrupt system that had preyed upon it for so long. Minority-owned businesses that had been harassed and extorted now thrived. Residents who had lived in fear of police encounters now worked alongside reformed officers on neighborhood watch programs. At the police station, the changes were visible everywhere. Gone were the hostile attitudes and aggressive postures that had characterized the old regime. In their place, Samuel observed officers who had been retrained in constitutional policing, de-escalation techniques, and community engagement. The short-sleeved and long-sleeved uniforms now represented service rather than oppression. Captain Nina Calloway had implemented sweeping reforms that went far beyond what federal oversight required. Body cameras were mandatory and couldn't be turned off. Every arrest required a supervisor's review within 24 hours. Community liaisons attended roll call meetings to share resident concerns directly with officers. The department's new mission statement, prominently displayed in the lobby, emphasized protection and service rather than enforcement and control. Officer Tamara Jenkins had developed a training program that was being studied by departments nationwide. Her curriculum didn't just teach proper procedures, it forced officers to confront their own biases and understand the historical context of policing in minority communities. Every officer was required to spend time volunteering in community organizations, building relationships that humanized the people they served. The evening news that day featured a segment on the department's transformation. The reporter interviewed residents who spoke cautiously but optimistically about the changes they'd observed. Children who once ran when they saw police cars now waved. Parents who had taught their sons to fear every interaction with law enforcement began to see officers as potential allies rather than automatic threats. Mayor Lorraine Castillo, who had survived the recall election by committing to comprehensive reform, stood with Samuel as they announced the next phase of community healing. A citizen review board with subpoena power, mandatory bias training for all city employees, a civilian police monitor with direct access to all department records and activities. As the sun set on this day of dedication and renewal, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The viral video that had shocked the nation, the federal investigation that had exposed systematic corruption, the trials that had delivered justice, the reforms that had rebuilt trust. Each step had been necessary, each victory hard-fought. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during the evening community meeting when a teenager approached Samuel with a question that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. "Mr. Ortega," the young man said, "I want to be a police officer, but I want to be one who makes things better, not worse. What should I do?" Samuel looked into the young man's earnest eyes and saw the future of law enforcement. Officers who understood that their badge was a responsibility, not a weapon. Police who saw community members as neighbors to protect rather than suspects to control. Law enforcement that truly lived up to the ideals of justice and service. Study hard, Samuel told him. Learn about the Constitution, about civil rights, about the history of your community. And never forget that the uniform makes you a servant of the people, not their master. The transformation wasn't complete. Rebuilding trust would take years, perhaps generations. There would be setbacks and challenges, but the foundation had been laid for something that had never existed before in this community. A police department that truly served and protected everyone equally. As Samuel drove home through streets that were now safe for everyone, he thought about the cost of justice and the price of change. His own ordeal had been painful and humiliating, but it had also been the catalyst for reforms that would protect countless others from experiencing what he had endured. The community had learned that accountability was possible. The police department had learned that constitutional policing was not only required but beneficial. The justice system had proven that no one was above the law. And young people had seen that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult and dangerous, could literally change the world. Justice had been served. Renewal had begun. And in a small suburban community in Virginia, the arc of the moral universe had bent visibly toward justice, proving that change was not only possible but inevitable when good people refused to stay silent in the face of wrong. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.